There is something you have been looking at your entire life without ever truly seeing it. Not the circumstances, not the relationships, not the patterns that keep repeating no matter how many times you swear, "This time will be different." You have been looking at all of those. You have been studying them, analyzing them, trying to fix them, trying to escape them, trying to understand why they keep happening to you. But that is precisely the problem. You have been looking at the screen, and no one told you to turn around and look at the projector. Because here is what Hermeticism actually is. Not a mystery school, not a collection of ancient symbols, not a spiritual aesthetic for people who like candles and esoteric bookmarks. Hermeticism is a precise technical description of how reality works. It is the oldest operating manual for consciousness ever written. And its central claim, the one that changes everything the moment you actually understand it, is this: the universe is mental, not metaphorically, not poetically. Structurally, fundamentally, at the level of what reality actually is. It is mental, which means every problem you see outside of you, every pattern, every person, every repeating circumstance is not happening to you. It is being projected by you. And the moment you stop looking at the screen and turn toward the projector, nothing is ever the same. I want you to sit with that for a moment, not rush past it. Not agree with it intellectually while your attention stays fixed on the problems outside. Actually feel what it means. If the universe is mental, if the fabric of what you call reality is not a fixed external structure but a field of consciousness expressing itself, then the thing you have been fighting, the thing you have been trying to change, the thing you have been surviving, it is not out there. It has never been out there. It has always been in here. And the moment you see that clearly, the moment you actually look at the projector instead of the screen, everything that was running your life from the shadows steps into the light. And what steps into the light cannot stay the same. This is what the ancient Hermetic teachers understood. This is what they encoded in the Emerald Tablet, in the Kybalion, in the mystery traditions that were deliberately hidden from mass consciousness for centuries. Not because the knowledge was dangerous, because it was liberating. And liberation, as history has demonstrated again and again, is the one thing that power structures cannot afford to give freely. But you are here, which means something in you already knows. Something in you recognized the title of this transmission before your analytical mind could catch up and explain why. Something in you has been circling this truth for a long time, getting close and then pulling back, because some part of you understands what happens when you actually see it. When you see it, you cannot unsee it. And when you cannot unsee it, you cannot keep living the way you have been living. So let's begin. Let's actually begin. Not with the comfortable version of Hermeticism, not with a version that makes you feel special and mystically gifted. With the precise, unflinching version, the one that requires you to look directly at yourself and see what is actually there. Look closer. For most of your life, you have been operating from a model of reality that is fundamentally broken. Not slightly off, not missing a few pieces, broken at the foundation. And the reason you have not questioned it is not because you are unintelligent. It is because the model was installed so early, reinforced so consistently, and shared by so many people around you that it became invisible. It became the water you swim in. The model is this: you are a body with a mind, living in a physical world that exists independently of you, and your job is to navigate that world, compete within it, Accumulate enough of its resources to feel safe and try to make it give you what you want before you die. That is the operating system most of humanity is running. And when you look at what that operating system produces, the chronic anxiety, the exhaustion, the sense that no matter what you achieve, you still feel incomplete, the relationships built on need rather than love, the decisions made from fear rather than clarity, you begin to understand that this is not a software glitch. This is a fundamental architectural error. Because what the Hermetic tradition understood, and what modern quantum physics is now beginning to confirm in its own language, is that consciousness is not a product of the physical world. Consciousness is the substrate of the physical world. It does not emerge from matter. Matter emerges from it. This is not philosophy. This is measurable. The double-slit experiment, one of the most replicated experiments in the history of physics, demonstrates that particles of matter do not have a fixed location or a fixed behavior until they are observed. Before observation, they exist as a wave of probability, a superposition of all possible states simultaneously. The moment a conscious observer measures them, the wave collapses into a single definite outcome. Read that again slowly. Before you look, reality exists as pure potential. The moment you look, it collapses into a specific form. What you observe, you change, not as a nice idea, as a measurable physical phenomenon. The Hermetic teachers said this 4,000 years ago. They said, the all is mind, the universe is mental. They said, as above, so below, as within, so without. They said, what you hold in consciousness, you manifest in form. And the scientific establishment spent centuries dismissing this as primitive mysticism. Until quantum mechanics arrived and said, in the precise language of mathematics and repeatable experiment, that the observer is not separate from what is observed. The observer participates in the creation of what is observed. You are not a passive witness to a reality that exists without you. You are an active participant in its construction, every moment, every day. With every pattern of attention you hold, every frequency of consciousness you sustain, every belief you treat as fact, you are collapsing the quantum field into specific lived experience. And here is where it stops being abstract and starts being the most important thing you have ever heard. If reality is a field of probability that collapses based on the frequency of your consciousness, then every problem you see in your life is not evidence of what the world is doing to you. It is evidence of what your consciousness is doing. It is a readout, a projection, a mirror. The Hermetic principle of mentalism does not say the world is fake. It says the world is a precise reflection of the state of mind that is observing it, which means the moment you change what is happening at the level of the observer, what is happening at the level of the observed has no choice but to change with it. But look closer, because here's where most people get this wrong. When they hear that reality reflects their inner state, they immediately try to fix their inner state. They try to think more positive thoughts. They try to visualize what they want. They try to raise their vibration. They try to manifest. And then they wonder why nothing changes, or why it changes briefly and then snaps back. The reason is that they are still operating from the same broken model. They are still treating consciousness as a tool they can use to manipulate an external reality. They are still positioned as a self that is separate from the field, trying to influence it from the outside. That is not what the Hermetic tradition teaches. That is not what quantum observation reveals. The observer does not manipulate the field. The observer is the field. And the field responds not to your intentions, not to your visualizations, not to the frequency you are trying to project. It responds to what you actually are, to the sum total of what you are holding in consciousness, including the parts you are not looking at, especially the parts you are not looking at. Because what you are not observing in yourself is not neutral. It is not sitting quietly in the background, waiting for you to be ready. It is actively shaping your reality. It is the projector running in the dark, casting images on the screen of your life that you keep trying to change by rearranging the furniture in the room. The shadow material, the beliefs you have never questioned, the wounds you have never directly looked at, the identities you are defending without knowing you are defending them. This is what the Hermetic tradition calls the unconscious mind. And in quantum terms, it is the unobserved portion of the field. And the unobserved portion of the field does not collapse into clarity. It remains in superposition. It remains as a wave of every possible negative expression, cycling through your life in pattern after pattern, looking different each time but sourced from the same unexamined place. This is why your patterns repeat. This is why the relationship dynamic changes but the feeling stays the same. This is why you achieve the goal and still feel incomplete. This is why you move cities, change jobs, end friendships, and find yourself in an eerily familiar situation 6 months later. You changed the screen, but the projector is still running the same reel. If what we are uncovering here is landing for you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this transmission reach the people who are ready to look. Look closer. Let me show you something. There is a story I want to tell you about a man named Elias, and I want you to watch this carefully because Elias is not a historical figure. He is a mirror, and what you see in his story is what you have been refusing to see in your own. Elias was a builder, not of houses or bridges. He built systems. He was the kind of person who, when he encountered a problem, immediately began constructing a solution. When his life felt out of control, he built routines. When relationships felt uncertain, he built walls of logic and competence that kept the uncertainty at bay. When his sense of purpose felt hollow, he built bigger goals and pursued them with more intensity. He was extraordinarily good at building, and his life from the outside looked like the product of someone who had figured it out. The career, the discipline, the appearance of someone who had their reality firmly in hand. But Elias had a room in his house that he never entered, not a literal room, though there was something almost spatial about it in his experience. It was a room in his inner architecture, a place where he had stored, with great care and great deliberateness, every question he could not afford to answer, every feeling that threatened the structure he had built, every recognition that something was fundamentally wrong at a level his building could not reach. He did not avoid this room because he was weak. He avoided it because he was smart. He had understood early in his life that looking at certain things would require him to dismantle everything he had built. And the building was all he had. The building was who he was. One day, Elias encountered a teacher, not a guru, not a spiritual authority, simply a person who saw clearly. And this person said to him something that no one had ever said before. She said, "I notice you build everything except understanding." And she pointed not at his life, but at the room. Elias felt something happen in his body when she said it, a kind of recognition that arrived before his mind could intercept it. And then his mind did intercept it, and he explained, carefully and at length, why the room was not relevant. Why what was in there had nothing to do with what he was trying to accomplish. Why looking backward was counterproductive when there was so much to build forward. The teacher listened to all of this. And then she said, "How long have you been building the same thing?" Elias stopped, and in the silence after that question, he heard it. The pattern, the repetition, the fact that every structure he had built had eventually failed in the exact same way, and he had responded to each failure by building something larger and more elaborate to replace it. He had been building the same thing for 20 years, calling it different names, convinced each time that this version would finally be strong enough to hold. The teacher said, "You cannot build your way out of something you will not look at," and she left him with the room. Elias stood outside the door for a long time, and then he opened it. What he found inside was not what he expected. He expected chaos. He expected something terrifying and overwhelming. Instead, he found something very small, a belief, installed so early it had no memory attached to it, just a frequency. A belief that said, "You are not enough as you are," that everything you build is an attempt to compensate for something fundamentally missing at the center of you. He looked at it. Not with analysis, not with the intention to fix it, he simply looked. And as he looked, something extraordinary happened. The belief did not grow. It did not overwhelm him. It began to dissolve, not because he argued with it or replaced it with a better belief, but because the act of clear, direct observation removed the only thing that had given it power, the darkness of being unseen. What you do not observe controls you. What you observe, you change. Not by trying to change it, by seeing it clearly. Elias walked out of the room a different person, not because he had fixed anything, because he had finally looked, and what he had been building against, the hollow center, the sense of fundamental inadequacy, it was not a fact about him. It was a projection, a frequency he had been sustaining in the dark and which had been collapsing his quantum field into a life that kept confirming it. The moment he saw it, it lost its power, not all at once, not without some grief for the years of building. But the pattern broke, because the projector had been seen, and what is seen in clear light cannot keep operating in the dark. And you have a room too. You know which one. You have been walking past it for years, sometimes pausing at the door, sometimes touching the handle, and then finding something urgent to attend to, something to build, something to fix on the screen. Today you are going to open it, not because I am telling you to, because something in you is ready, because you would not still be here listening this carefully if you were not already standing at the door. What did you see when you stopped looking away? If something has already surfaced for you, a belief, a room you recognized, a pattern that suddenly made sense, drop it in the comments, not to perform it, to anchor it. What you name from the observer position, you begin to transform. We will come back to that room. First, let's go deeper into what you are actually seeing when you look at your life. The Hermetic principle of correspondence. As above, so below, as within, so without, is not a metaphor. It is a structural law. It describes the relationship between different levels of reality, and it says that each level is a precise reflection of every other level. The macrocosm reflects the microcosm, the outer reflects the inner. The pattern at the scale of your personal life reflects the pattern at the scale of your consciousness. This means that when you look at your life, really look at it, not at the version you present to others, not at the goals you are pursuing, but at the actual texture of your daily experience. You are looking at a map of your consciousness. Every recurring conflict is a map coordinate. Every pattern of avoidance is a map coordinate. Every relationship that triggers the same feeling is a map coordinate. Every financial pattern, every health pattern, every emotional pattern, each one is pointing at something specific in the projector. Most people look at these patterns and see problems to be solved. The Hermetic observer looks at these patterns and sees information, data, a precise readout of what is being held in consciousness below the level of deliberate awareness. This is the difference between reacting and witnessing, and it is the most important distinction in the entire Hermetic tradition. When you react to your life, you are engaged with the screen. You are trying to change the images by interacting with them directly. You argue with the conflict, try to escape the pattern, work harder against the financial limitation, push through the health issue. You are busy. You are active. You feel like you are doing something. And the pattern continues because the projector has not been touched. When you witness your life, when you step into the observer position and simply look at what is there without immediately trying to fix it, without defending yourself against it, without explaining it away, something begins to happen. The pattern becomes visible as a pattern. The frequency that is sustaining it becomes observable. And what becomes observable becomes subject to the fundamental law of quantum reality. The observer changes what is observed. Not by trying to change it, by observing it. This is the most counterintuitive thing in the Hermetic tradition, and it is the thing that most people who encounter this teaching cannot quite bring themselves to trust, because we have been trained so deeply, consistently from childhood, to believe that action is the mechanism of change. That if something is wrong, you do something about it. You fix it, fight it, flee from it, or force it into submission. The Hermetic tradition says, before you do anything, see it. Really see it. Because action taken from an unexamined state of consciousness simply reinforces the pattern it is trying to break. It is the building that Elias kept building. More sophisticated, more effortful, the same result. But action taken from a state of clear observation, action that emerges from the observer position after the pattern has been seen and the projector has been identified, that action is different in quality. It is not driven by the pattern. It is not a reaction to the screen. It is an expression of clarity. And clarity in a mental universe is the most powerful creative force that exists. Now I want to give you a practice, not a thought exercise, an actual observation. And I need you to do this now, not later, not after the video, now, because the understanding we are building here is not intellectual. It is experiential. And experience requires you to be present. Pause what you are doing in your mind for a moment. Not stop thinking. You cannot stop thinking by trying. Just let the thoughts continue and bring your attention to the one who is noticing the thoughts, not the thoughts themselves. The awareness that is aware of the thoughts. Notice that awareness is already present. You did not create it just now. It has been here the entire time, quietly witnessing everything, every thought, every feeling, every sensation, without being disturbed by any of it. This awareness is what the Hermetic tradition calls the observer. It is what quantum physics calls the measuring device. It is what meditation traditions across every culture call the witness. Notice that this awareness has no problem. It is not anxious. It is not trying to fix anything. It is simply present, Simply seeing, it is the eye that sees without being seen. The observer that cannot itself be observed from outside, only recognized from within. Now from this position, from the awareness that is watching your thoughts rather than being your thoughts, look at your life, not with judgment, not with the intention to change anything. Simply look. What patterns do you see? What keeps recurring? What have you been trying to fix on the screen while something in the projector has remained untouched? Let what you see be there. Do not rush to interpret it. Do not immediately formulate a plan. Just look. Because looking from this position, from the observer position, is already the beginning of transformation, not a step toward it, the beginning of it. Sit with that for a moment. Don't rush past what you just saw. Now let's go deeper into the mechanics. Because the Hermetic principles are not 7 separate laws. They are 7 facets of a single truth, each one revealing a different angle of the same fundamental reality. And when you understand how they interlock, you understand the precise architecture of how your consciousness creates your experience. We have spoken about mentalism, the all is mind, the universe is mental. Consciousness is the substrate of reality. Now let's look at correspondence and vibration together, because these 2 principles explain the mechanism by which the mental becomes the physical. The principle of vibration says that everything in the universe is in motion. Nothing is at rest. Everything vibrates, from the densest matter to the subtlest thought, from the slowest frequency of physical substance to the highest frequency of pure consciousness. Everything is vibration, and the difference between one thing and another is not substance but frequency. Stone and thought are not different kinds of things. They are the same thing vibrating at different rates. This is not metaphor. This is physics. At the quantum level, what we call matter is not solid substance. It is energy vibrating at specific frequencies, and what we experience as physical solidity is the interaction between those vibrational fields and our sensory apparatus. The table is not solid. It is a field of energy vibrating at a frequency that creates the experience of solidity when it interacts with the field of energy that is your hand. What this means in practical terms is that your consciousness has a frequency, not as a nice idea, as a measurable reality. The state of your consciousness, the sum total of your beliefs, your habitual emotional states, your dominant patterns of attention, produces a specific vibrational signature. And by the principle of correspondence, that vibrational signature is reflected in the physical reality you inhabit. This is the mechanism. This is the technical answer to the question of how the inner becomes the outer. Your consciousness vibrates at a specific frequency. The quantum field responds to that frequency by collapsing into the physical experiences, relationships, and circumstances that match it. Not as punishment, not as reward, as pure correspondence, as above, so below, as within, so without. Which means, and this is where the full weight of this lands, you do not attract what you want. You attract what you are, not what you are trying to be, not what you are performing or visualizing or affirming. What you actually are, at the level of your unexamined beliefs, your habitual emotional states, your unconscious patterns of perception. And this is why the work of Hermeticism is not the work of manifestation, it is the work of observation. Because you cannot change what you are at the level of consciousness by trying to change what you are projecting at the level of behavior. You can only change it by seeing it, by bringing the unobserved portions of your consciousness into the light of awareness. by looking at the projector. Look closer. Here is what no one tells you about the Hermetic principle of polarity. Most people encounter this principle and understand it as a comforting idea. Everything has an opposite, and opposites are really just different degrees of the same thing. Fear and love are on the same spectrum. Light and dark are the same phenomenon at different intensities. This is true. And it is also, in its comfortable version, a way of avoiding what the principle actually demands of you. The principle of polarity does not just say that opposites are connected. It says that you can transmute one into the other. That the same mental alchemy that changes the frequency of a thought can change the frequency of an emotion, a belief, a pattern of experience. Not by suppressing the negative pole, not by denying it exists, but by raising the vibration along the spectrum from the lower pole toward the higher. And here is what that requires. You have to look at the lower pole directly. You cannot transmute what you cannot see. You cannot raise the frequency of a belief you have not acknowledged holding. You cannot move from fear toward love while you are pretending you are not afraid. The Hermetic tradition is extraordinarily precise about this. The alchemists were not trying to turn lead into gold as a literal physical experiment. They were describing a process of consciousness. Lead is the unexamined, unobserved, unconscious material of the psyche. The fears, the wounds, the limiting beliefs, the patterns that operate in the dark. Gold is what that material becomes when it is brought into the full light of conscious observation and transmuted by the clarity of the witness. The furnace is not a physical instrument. The furnace is your attention, your willingness to look. And this is why so many people who encounter Hermetic or spiritual teachings remain stuck. They love the idea of the gold. They are enthusiastic about vibration and consciousness and manifesting. But they will not sit in the furnace. They will not look at the lead. Because looking at the lead, really looking at it, without flinching, without immediately trying to fix it or explain it or reframe it into something more comfortable, requires a quality of courage that most spiritual teachings do not prepare you for. Quantum Watcher is not here to give you the comfortable version. The comfortable version is everywhere. It is not working. Let me ask you something directly. What is the thing in your life that you have been trying to change the longest? Not a goal you have not yet achieved. The thing that keeps happening, the pattern that keeps repeating, the feeling that keeps returning despite everything you have done to make it stop. Hold that in your awareness for a moment, not the circumstances of it. The feeling at the center of it, the core experience that is always there underneath the different situations that seem to produce it. Now ask yourself, when did you first feel this? Not the specific memory, though a memory may arise. The frequency. When did this frequency first become familiar? When did it first become the background hum of your experience? You do not need to answer that question with a story. You need only to feel the recognition that this frequency is old, that it predates the current circumstances by a long time, that the current circumstances are not producing it, they are matching it. They are the quantum field collapsing into correspondence with a frequency that has been running in your consciousness for years, possibly decades, possibly since before you had language for what you were experiencing. That recognition, that moment of seeing the pattern as older than its current expression, is the beginning of the work. Because in that recognition, you have moved from the screen to the projector. You have stopped looking at the circumstance and started looking at the source. and the source, once seen, is already beginning to change. Now let's look at the Hermetic principle of cause and effect, because this is the one that most directly addresses the question of personal sovereignty, and the one that is most consistently misunderstood. The principle of cause and effect says that nothing happens by chance. Every effect has a cause, every cause has an effect. The chain of causation is unbroken and universal. There is no such thing as luck or accident in a mental universe, only the precise correspondence between a state of consciousness and its reflection in physical experience. Most people hear this and feel either empowered or condemned. Empowered if they believe they have been doing the right things. Condemned if they believe the difficult things in their life are somehow their fault. But that is a misreading, because the Hermetic tradition does not say you consciously chose your patterns. It says your patterns are the effect of causes that operate at a level of consciousness below your deliberate awareness. The unconscious mind, the unobserved portions of your consciousness, are the most powerful causes in your life, and they are powerful precisely because they are unobserved. Here is the distinction that changes everything. There are two positions you can occupy in relation to the law of cause and effect. The first position is that of the effect. The person who experiences what happens to them as the product of external causes. Circumstances, other people, luck, fate. From this position, you are always responding to causes that seem to originate outside of you. You are always at the effect end of the chain. You are, in the Hermetic language, a slave to the law rather than a master of it. The second position is that of the cause, not the cause of specific external events. You cannot control the quantum field by trying to control it, but the cause of your own state of consciousness, the one who chooses, with deliberate awareness, what frequencies to hold, what patterns to observe and thereby transform, what quality of attention to bring to the field of reality. The Hermetic masters called this the distinction between the initiate and the common person, not as a hierarchy of worth, but as a description of two fundamentally different relationships to the law of causation. The common person is driven by the law. The initiate uses the law, not by circumventing it or overriding it, but by operating at a level of consciousness where they are the cause rather than the effect. And how do you move from effect to cause? Not by trying harder, not by manifesting more deliberately, by observing more clearly, by bringing the unexamined causes, the unconscious patterns, the unobserved beliefs, the frequencies running in the dark, into the light of conscious awareness. Because what you observe, you change. And what you bring from the unconscious into the conscious, from the unobserved into the observed, from the dark into the light. That is the alchemical work. That is the transmutation. That is the movement from lead to gold. That is Hermeticism. Let me take you deeper into the principle of mentalism, because we have only touched its surface. When the Hermetic tradition says the all is mind, it is not saying your individual mind creates reality. It is saying something far more precise and far more radical than that. The all, the totality of existence, the infinite field of consciousness from which all of reality emerges, is mind, not a mind, not the mind of a God separate from you, the mind. The one consciousness in which all individual minds exist as expressions, the way waves exist in an ocean. You are not separate from the all. You are the all expressing itself through a particular configuration of consciousness. You are not a piece of the universe. You are the universe experiencing itself from a specific point of view. The Hermetic text says, "The all is in all, and all is in the all," which means there is no separation between your consciousness and the consciousness of the universe. There is only the illusion of separation created by the particular configuration of your individual perspective. The veil of separation is not a fact about reality. It is a fact about the level of consciousness from which you are currently observing. And here's what this means for your life. When you feel isolated, when you feel like you are fighting alone against a world that is indifferent or hostile to you, you are experiencing the illusion of separation. You are experiencing what happens when the all looks at itself through a lens of limitation and forgets what it is. You are experiencing the most fundamental suffering available to a conscious being, the experience of being cut off from the source of your own existence. Every other form of suffering in human life is a variation of this one. The anxiety is the vibration of separation. The loneliness is the experience of separation, the sense that something is fundamentally missing, that you are incomplete, that the world is not giving you what you need. All of this is the signature of a consciousness that has forgotten it is the all. And the Hermetic tradition says, you do not need to achieve reunion with the all. You are the all. You do not need to find your way back to the source. You are the source. The work is not to add something to yourself. The work is to observe clearly and without flinching the beliefs and patterns that are sustaining the illusion of separation, and to watch what happens to those beliefs when they are seen clearly. Because what cannot survive clear observation is the illusion. Reality can survive observation. Truth can survive observation. In fact, truth requires observation to become visible. But the illusion, the constructed story of separation, of inadequacy, of being a small and isolated self in a vast, indifferent universe, the illusion dissolves the moment it is seen clearly for what it is. This is not a metaphor. This is the direct experience of every person who has ever sat in genuine meditation, not the practice of relaxation or stress reduction, but the practice of turning the observer's gaze back on itself. The moment the observer observes itself observing, something extraordinary happens. The sense of being a separate self looking at a world outside it begins to dissolve, not into confusion or chaos, but into a vast, clear, open awareness that recognizes itself as the space in which all experience arises. That recognition is what the Hermetic tradition calls gnosis, not knowledge about the truth, direct recognition of the truth. The experience of knowing from the inside that you are not a piece of the universe. You are the universe. You are the all looking at itself through this particular pair of eyes. And from that recognition, everything changes. Not because you try to change it, because you have seen what you actually are. And what has been seen cannot be unseen. Look closer. I want to go back to the room in Elias's house because there is a second part to his story that I did not tell you yet. And it is the part that matters most. After Elias opened the room and looked at the belief at its center, the belief that he was not enough as he was, the belief that had been running his life from the dark for decades, he did not immediately feel liberated. He felt grief, and then he felt something he had not expected. He felt the urge to close the room again. Because the belief, even as it was dissolving in the light of observation, was familiar. And the familiar, even when it is painful, even when it has been the source of years of suffering, carries a strange comfort, It is known. It is predictable. It is the architecture of the identity you have built your entire life around. And the dissolution of it, even into something more real, even into something more free, feels like a kind of death. This is the moment where most people turn back, not because they are weak, because they are human. Because the observer position requires something that is deeply counterintuitive. It requires you to be willing to let the constructed self dissolve, to let the patterns that have defined you be seen for what they are, constructions, not truths, and to remain in the observation without immediately rebuilding. Elias stood in the room and felt the grief, and felt the urge to close the door, and felt something else underneath both of those. A vast, open, quiet awareness that was not disturbed by any of it. An awareness that had been present the entire time, watching everything, undisturbed by the building and the failing and the grief and the recognition. An awareness that did not need the belief to be true, that did not need the room to be closed, that was simply, quietly, completely present. He recognized this awareness, not as something new, as something he had always been, underneath everything he had built on top of it. And in that recognition, the second thing happened, not the dissolution of the belief that had already begun. The recognition of what remained after the belief began to dissolve. Not nothing, not chaos, the observer. The vast, clear, undisturbed awareness that he had always been, that had always been present, that had been watching the building and the failing and the patterns and the grief with perfect equanimity. He understood then that the observer was not a state he needed to achieve. It was what he was when he stopped performing the role of the builder, when he stopped identifying with the construction and recognized himself as the one who was watching the construction. And from that position, from the observer position, the question of whether he was enough as he was simply did not arise, because the observer does not have a problem with what it observes. The observer is not trying to be more than it is. The observer is already the most fundamental thing there is, the awareness in which all of reality arises. Elias walked out of the room for the second time, and this time he did not feel like a different person. He felt like himself for the first time. Not the self he had been building toward, not the self he thought he needed to become, the self that had always been there, watching. And you have been watching longer than you realize. Something in you has always been the observer. Something in you has never been confused by the patterns, never been trapped by the beliefs, never been the victim of the circumstances. Something in you has always known, has always seen clearly, has always been present, undisturbed, beneath everything that has seemed to disturb you. That is not a spiritual achievement. That is what you are. And the moment you stop identifying with the construction and recognize yourself as the observer, the construction loses its grip. Not because you fought it, because you saw through it. This is the Hermetic teaching in its fullest expression. The all is mind. You are the all. The observer is the all looking at itself. And the moment the all recognizes itself, the moment the observer recognizes itself as the observer, the illusion of separation dissolves, and with it, every pattern that the illusion was sustaining. Now let's go to the practice, because everything we have been building toward requires this. I want you to close your eyes if you are in a position to do so safely. If not, soften your gaze and let your attention turn inward. Bring to mind the pattern in your life that you identified earlier, the repeating experience, the recurring feeling. Hold it in your awareness, not as a problem to be solved, but as an object of observation. Now notice, who is observing it? There is the pattern, and there is the one who is watching the pattern. There is the feeling, and there is the awareness in which the feeling is arising. Notice the space between the observer and the observed. Notice that the observer is not the feeling, the observer is not the pattern. The observer is the one who is watching both. Stay in that position for a moment. The observer position, not thinking about the pattern, not trying to fix it, simply watching it from the position of the awareness that contains it. Now notice something. From this position, the pattern does not feel threatening. It feels like data. It feels like information. It feels like a frequency that is visible now in a way it was not visible when you were inside it, when you were identified with it, when you were the pattern rather than the one watching the pattern. From this position, ask yourself, what is this pattern showing me? Not what is wrong with me. What is this pattern pointing at in the projector? What frequency has been running below the level of my deliberate awareness that is producing this as its reflection? Let the answer arise without forcing it. It may come as a word, an image, a feeling, a memory, a sudden recognition. Whatever arises, simply observe it. Do not interpret it immediately. Do not judge it. Simply see it. This is the beginning of the alchemical work. Not the visualization, not the affirmation, the seeing, the clear, direct, unflinching observation of what has been running in the dark. Open your eyes when you are ready, and notice that something has shifted, not dramatically perhaps, but something has moved, because it has. Because observation changes what is observed. Because the moment you brought the observer's gaze to the unexamined pattern, the pattern began its transformation. That is not belief. That is quantum mechanics. Has there been a moment in your own life when seeing something clearly, really looking at it without flinching, dissolved its power over you? Tell me what you saw in the comments. What you name from the observer position continues its transformation. Let's talk about the principle of rhythm, because this is the one that explains why the work of observation is not a one-time event. Why seeing clearly once does not mean you will never be pulled back into the pattern. Why the observer position is a practice, not an achievement. The principle of rhythm says that everything in the universe moves in cycles. The tide comes in and goes out. The pendulum swings left and then right. Consciousness expands and then contracts. Clarity arises and then clouds. The high follows the low and the low follows the high in an endless oscillation that is the fundamental rhythm of existence. Most people experience this as discouraging. They have a breakthrough, a moment of clarity, a genuine recognition, and then the old pattern reasserts itself. The old feeling returns. The old belief is suddenly convincing again. And they interpret this as evidence that the breakthrough was not real, or that they have failed, or that the work does not work. But the Hermetic understanding of rhythm says something different. It says the swing of the pendulum is inevitable. What is not inevitable is where you stand while it swings. The initiate does not stop the rhythm. The initiate learns to stand at the center of the pendulum's arc rather than at its extreme ends. To be the observer of the rhythm rather than the one who is swept back and forth by it. To notice the contraction without becoming the contraction. To see the return of the old pattern without re-identifying with the old pattern. This is why the observer practice is precisely that, a practice. Not because you need to keep achieving the observer position from scratch, but because the rhythm will pull you toward identification with the pattern, and the practice is the act of noticing when that has happened and returning to the observer position. Again and again, not with frustration, with the same quality of clear, quiet observation that you bring to everything else. Because each time you return to the observer position from inside the pattern, you are doing something profound. You are demonstrating to your own consciousness that the pattern is not what you are, that you can be inside it and still find the observer, that the observer is always available, always present, always the deepest truth of what you are, no matter how completely the pattern has seemed to consume you. And over time, not through effort, but through repeated recognition, the center of gravity shifts. The pattern loses density. The return to the observer becomes faster, more natural, less effortful, not because the rhythm has stopped, because you have learned to stand at the center. This is the Hermetic mastery of rhythm, not the elimination of the oscillation, the ability to observe it without being swept by it. Now let's address something directly, because I know there is a part of you that has been listening to all of this and thinking, this is beautiful, but what do I actually do? What are the practical steps? How do I apply this to my job, my relationship, my finances, my health? And the answer is, you apply it by doing what we have been doing, by looking, by observing, by bringing the quality of the witness to every area of your life where you have been reacting instead of seeing. But let me be specific, because the Hermetic tradition is not vague about application, it is precise. In your relationships, the principle of correspondence says that every person who triggers a strong reaction in you is a mirror. Not a mirror of who they are, a mirror of what is unobserved in you. The qualities that irritate you most in others are the qualities you have most consistently refused to see in yourself. The behaviors that wound you most deeply are activating a frequency in you that was already there before the relationship began. This does not mean the other person's behavior is your fault. It means the intensity of your reaction is information about you. It means the wound they seem to be causing was already present in the projector, and they are simply the screen on which it is being projected. The Hermetic practice in relationship is not to withdraw from the trigger or to manage your reaction. It is to use the trigger as a pointer, to look at what in you is being activated, to observe the frequency that the other person's behavior is resonating with, to see the unobserved material that is being illuminated by the conflict. Because when you see it, when you bring the observer's gaze to the wound that is being triggered rather than to the person who triggered it, two things happen. The intensity of the reaction decreases, not because you suppressed it, but because you have seen its source, and the source, once seen, begins to lose its charge. And your relationship with the other person shifts. Not necessarily the relationship itself, they may continue to behave exactly as they have been. But your experience of them shifts because you are no longer projecting the unobserved frequency onto them. You are seeing them more clearly, as they actually are, rather than as a screen for what you have not yet looked at in yourself. In your finances, the principle of vibration says that your relationship with money is a precise readout of your relationship with value, your own value. Every belief you hold about whether you deserve abundance, whether the world is safe or hostile, whether giving and receiving are in balance, whether you can trust the flow of life, all of this is encoded in your financial experience. This is not about positive thinking. This is about observation. Look at your financial patterns without judgment, not at the numbers, at the feelings. What do you feel when you spend money, when you receive money, when you think about money? What beliefs are encoded in those feelings? What frequency are those beliefs vibrating at? And then look at where those beliefs came from. Not to assign blame, to see the source, to bring the unexamined assumptions about value and abundance into the light of conscious observation. Because those assumptions, unexamined, are collapsing the quantum field into financial experiences that confirm them. And examined, truly seen, clearly and without flinching, they begin to lose their deterministic power. In your health, the principle of correspondence says that the body is the most precise mirror of the state of consciousness. Not because illness is your fault, because the body is a field of vibration that responds with extraordinary sensitivity to the frequencies sustained in consciousness. Chronic stress, chronic fear, chronic self-abandonment. These are not just emotional states. They are vibrational frequencies that the body is translating into physical symptoms. The Hermetic approach to health is not to ignore the body or to treat it as separate from consciousness. It is to look at the body's signals as information, to ask what the symptom is pointing at in the projector, to observe the emotional and psychological patterns that are being expressed in physical form, not instead of medical care, alongside it, as a parallel inquiry into the consciousness that is creating the conditions in which the physical experience is occurring. This is the application of Hermeticism, not a set of rituals, not a manifestation technique. A quality of observation brought to every area of life with the understanding that what you observe, you change, and what you bring from the dark into the light of conscious awareness is already beginning its transformation. Let me give you the third practice. Because we have built to this moment deliberately, and I want you to feel the full weight of what we are about to do. This practice is called the mirror, and it is the most direct application of the Hermetic principle of correspondence available to you. Think of one relationship in your life that carries the most charge, the most emotional intensity, the most recurring conflict or frustration or longing. It may be a romantic relationship, a family relationship, a friendship, a work relationship. The one that, when you think of it, produces the strongest feeling. Bring that relationship into your awareness. And now, instead of thinking about the other person, instead of reviewing their behavior, their patterns, their failures, their qualities, bring your attention to yourself in relation to them. Specifically, what is the feeling that this relationship most consistently produces in you? Name it as precisely as you can. Not a story about why you feel it, just the feeling itself. Now ask it, where else in your life do you feel this? Where else has this feeling been present? How far back does it go? And now the most important question. What would you have to believe about yourself, about your worth, your safety, your lovability, your adequacy, to consistently produce this feeling in the context of relationship? Let the answer arise. Do not judge it. Do not argue with it. Simply observe it. That belief, the one that just arose or the one you felt yourself resist, that is the frequency in the projector. That is what has been collapsing the quantum field into the relationship experience you have been having. Not the other person's behavior, not the circumstances. This belief, running unexamined, shaping every interaction, every expectation, every wound. Now observe the belief from the observer position, not from inside it, from the awareness that contains it, from the vast, clear, undisturbed witness that you are underneath everything you have believed yourself to be. From this position, ask, is this belief true? Not is it familiar? Not does it feel true? Is it actually fundamentally, observably true? And watch what happens when you ask that question from the observer position. Watch how the belief, which seemed like bedrock, seems suddenly less solid, less inevitable, more like a construction than a fact, more like a frequency that has been sustained in the dark than a truth about what you are. You do not need to replace it with a better belief. You do not need to affirm the opposite. You only need to see it clearly. Because what is seen clearly from the observer position begins to lose its deterministic power. The quantum field that was collapsing in accordance with it begins to become fluid again. The pattern that was locked begins to loosen. This is the alchemy. This is the furnace. This is the lead beginning its transformation into gold. Stay here for a moment, in the observer position, watching the belief without being the belief, being the awareness that contains the belief rather than the consciousness that is defined by it. And notice, the awareness itself has no problem. The awareness is not wounded by the belief. The awareness is not diminished by the pattern. The awareness is simply present, simply seeing, simply being what it has always been. That is you. That is what you actually are, not the belief, not the pattern, not the construction, the awareness, the observer, the all looking at itself through these particular eyes. Now let's look at the principle of gender, because this is the most misunderstood of the 7 Hermetic principles, and it is also, in many ways, the most practically important. The principle of gender does not refer to biological sex or social gender. It refers to 2 fundamental principles of consciousness that operate in everything: the principle of generation and the principle of reception. The masculine principle, the active, projecting, initiating force. The feminine principle, the receptive, containing, gestating force. And the Hermetic tradition says that both principles are present in everything and everyone. That the creative process requires both. That the masculine principle alone, pure action, pure projection, pure will, cannot create. It can only project into the void. And the feminine principle alone, pure reception, pure openness, pure allowing, cannot create either. It can only receive what is projected. Creation happens in the space between them, in the relationship between the projecting force and the receiving space, in the dynamic tension between initiative and surrender, between will and allowing, between doing and being. Most people in the modern world are deeply imbalanced in this regard. They are either overactive and always projecting, always doing, always forcing, always trying to make things happen through sheer will, or they are overpassive, always waiting, always hoping, always expecting reality to deliver what they have not yet initiated. The Hermetic balance is the observer who acts from clarity, the one who has first gone into the receptive mode of genuine observation, truly seeing what is there, truly receiving the information that the mirror of reality is offering, and then acts from that clarity, not from urgency, not from fear, from the precise understanding of what is actually happening at the level of the projector, and what specific shift in consciousness will allow the quantum field to reorganize. This is what it means to be sovereign, not to force reality into submission, to be so clear about what you are holding in consciousness that your actions are precise expressions of that clarity, rather than frantic reactions to the screen. The Hermetic master is not someone who has achieved perfect control over their external circumstances. They are someone who has achieved such clarity of observation that their relationship to circumstances is fundamentally different. They are not at the effect end of the causal chain. They are the cause, not of specific events, but of the quality of consciousness from which they meet every event. And that quality of consciousness, clear, observant, grounded in the recognition of what they actually are, is the most powerful creative force in a mental universe. Because the universe is mental, because the all is mind, because what you hold in consciousness with clarity and without resistance, the quantum field collapses into form, not as a reward for good behavior, as the fundamental law of a reality that is, at its deepest level, an expression of consciousness observing itself. Here's something I want you to consider. You have been here for a long time now. You have been listening, observing, doing the practices, and something has been happening in you while you have been doing that. Not the dramatic transformation that the comfortable version of spiritual teaching promises. Something more subtle and more real. You have been becoming the observer, not achieving it, returning to it, recognizing it. Because the observer is not a state you create through spiritual practice. It is what you are when you stop performing the role of the self that needs to be fixed, improved, or validated. It is the awareness that was always present, always seeing, always undisturbed by everything that seemed to disturb you. And from this position, from the observer position, which is the Hermetic position, which is the quantum position, which is the position of the all recognizing itself, your life looks different. Not because the circumstances have changed yet, because you are seeing them differently, because you are seeing them from the projector rather than from the screen, because you are seeing them as a readout of consciousness rather than as facts about what is possible for you. And what you see differently, you relate to differently. And what you relate to differently, you respond to differently. And what you respond to differently begins to change, not because you forced it, because the quantum field is responding to the new frequency of the observer. Because as within, so without. Because the universe is mental, and your consciousness is the mind in which your universe arises. Let me tell you about a second character. Her name is Mira, and Mira's story is different from Elias's in a way that is important. Mira was not a builder. She was a seeker. She had spent years pursuing spiritual understanding, reading every tradition, sitting with every teacher, accumulating a vast library of wisdom about consciousness and reality and the nature of the self. She could speak with great fluency about the observer effect, about Hermeticism, about quantum mechanics, about the nature of the all. And her life was not changing. The patterns were still there. The relationship still felt the same. The financial limitation was still present. The sense of something missing at the center of her experience was still there, underneath all the wisdom she had accumulated. She came to a teacher and said, "I understand all of this. I know the principles. I can explain the quantum observer effect. I know the Hermetic laws. Why is nothing changing?" And the teacher asked her one question. She said, When is the last time you actually looked? Not read about looking, not understood the concept of looking. Actually turn the observer's gaze on what you have been avoiding and looked. Mira was silent for a long time. And then she said, "I think I have been using the knowledge to avoid the looking." The teacher nodded. She said, "The map is not the territory. Understanding the principle of observation is not the same as observing. Knowing that the universe is mental is not the same as looking at what your mind is actually holding. The knowledge accumulated without the practice becomes another construction, another room full of beautiful objects that you use to avoid entering the one room that matters." Mira understood. She had been doing something very sophisticated and very human. She had been using spiritual knowledge as a way of feeling like she was doing the work without actually doing the work. The work being not the accumulation of understanding, but the direct, unflinching observation of what was actually there in her own consciousness. She went home and she sat with herself, not with a book, not with a teaching, with herself, with the actual texture of her experience, without the overlay of interpretation. She looked at the feeling she had been carrying for years, the sense of something missing, the quiet undercurrent of incompleteness. And instead of immediately reaching for an explanation, a framework, a principle that would make it mean something, she simply looked at it. And what she found was not what the books had prepared her for. It was simpler and more immediate and more uncomfortable than anything she had read. It was a very specific, very personal, very human grief, a grief she had been carrying since childhood, a grief that had never been witnessed, that had never been seen clearly by another person or by herself. She looked at it, and she wept. Not with interpretation, not with understanding, just with the raw, direct experience of finally seeing something that had been waiting to be seen for a very long time. And in the weeping, something released. The sense of incompleteness began to shift. Not because she had fixed it, because she had finally seen it. Because the grief unseen had been the frequency in the projector, the vibration of something that needed to be witnessed, that had been sustaining the experience of incompleteness in every area of her life, because it had never been given the one thing it needed to be directly, clearly, compassionately seen. This is what the Hermetic tradition means by the feminine principle of reception. The willingness to receive what is actually there, not what you want to be there, not what your framework says should be there, what is actually presently, specifically there in your own experience. And Mira, who had spent years accumulating wisdom, discovered that the most powerful thing she could do with all of that wisdom was to use it to look more clearly, not to explain what she saw, to see it, to be the observer, to give the unwitnessed parts of her experience the quality of attention that transforms. And her life began to change, not dramatically, not all at once, but the patterns began to shift. The relationships began to reflect something different. The financial situation began to move, because the frequency in the projector had changed, not through effort, through observation. Because what you observe, you change, and what you bring from the dark into the light of your awareness is already beginning its transformation the moment it is truly seen. You already see it. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet. The fact that you are still here means you are willing to look. That is rare. Most people encounter this kind of transmission and find a reason to stop watching before it gets to the part that requires something of them. You are still here. which means something in you is ready for what the observation reveals. So let me ask you directly, what is the thing you have been using the knowledge to avoid? What is the principle you have been accumulating without applying? What is the room you have been studying from the outside without entering? You know what it is. You have known throughout this entire transmission. It has been there at the edge of your awareness, the specific thing, the particular frequency, the precise experience that you have been circling without landing on. Land on it now, not later. Now. Look at it from the observer position, from the vast, clear, undisturbed awareness that you are underneath everything you have believed yourself to be. Look at it without flinching, without immediately reaching for an interpretation or a framework or a plan. Just look. And notice what happens when you do. Notice the quality of what arises in the space of clear observation. Notice that the thing you have been avoiding does not destroy you when you look at it directly. Notice that the awareness in which it arises is larger than it. Notice that you are larger than it, not because you are stronger than it, because you are the one who is watching it. And the one who watches is always larger than what is watched. This is the power of the observer, not the power of control, the power of clarity, the power of seeing, the power of being the awareness in which all of reality arises, rather than a small self inside the reality, trying to navigate it from within. The observer is the most powerful position in the universe, not because it controls, because it sees clearly. And clarity in a mental universe is the only force that transforms without resistance. I want to speak now about what happens after the seeing, because the Hermetic tradition does not stop at observation. It continues into what the observation reveals about how to live. When you have genuinely occupied the observer position, when you have looked clearly at the projector rather than the screen, something shifts in how you engage with the world. Not because you have become detached or passive, because you have become precise. Detachment is a misunderstanding of the observer position. The observer is not indifferent, the observer sees clearly, and clear seeing includes the full depth of what is there. The beauty, the grief, the love, the loss, the complexity of being a conscious being in a world of other conscious beings. The observer does not turn away from any of this. The observer is the one who can finally be fully present to all of it, without being overwhelmed by it, because the observer is not identified with it. The observer contains it. When you are fully present as the observer, you can love more deeply than you ever have, because you are not loving from need. You are not loving as the strategy to fill the incompleteness. You are loving from the fullness of an awareness that recognizes itself in everything it sees, that recognizes the same all in every other face, that sees in every other person's struggle the same fundamental experience of consciousness temporarily forgetting what it is. This is what the Hermetic tradition means by the dissolution of the belief in separation, not the elimination of individuality, not the merging of all identities into an undifferentiated mass. The recognition from the observer position that the separation between self and other is a construction of limited consciousness, and that beneath the construction there is only the all, experiencing itself through an infinite variety of particular perspectives. And from that recognition, action becomes different. Relationship becomes different. Your engagement with the world becomes different. Not because you have achieved some spiritual state that exempts you from the difficulties of human life, because you are meeting those difficulties from the observer position rather than from the reactive position, from clarity rather than from pattern, from the all rather than from the small, frightened, isolated self that the broken model of reality created. This is the practical application of Hermeticism, not a set of rituals, not a manifestation technique, a fundamental shift in the position from which you inhabit your life, from the effect end of the causal chain to the cause, from the screen to the projector, from the reactive self to the observing awareness. And the shift is available to you right now, not after more study, not after more preparation, right now. Because the observer is always already present. It is what you are when you stop performing the role of the self that needs to be fixed. It is the awareness that has been here the entire time, watching everything, undisturbed by everything, waiting, not impatiently because the observer does not experience impatience, simply present, simply available, simply being what it has always been. The question is only whether you are willing to recognize it, whether you are willing to stop looking at the screen and turn toward the projector, whether you are willing to look at what has been running your reality from the dark and bring it into the light of your clear, unflinching, compassionate awareness. You are, I know you are, because you are here, and something in you recognized this before your mind could catch up. Let me bring this to its completion, not its conclusion, because the work of observation does not conclude. It deepens. Each time you return to the observer position, you see something you could not see before. Each time you bring the unexamined into the examined, the pattern loses density and the clarity increases. The process is not linear, it is spiral. You return to the same places, but from a higher vantage point, with greater clarity, with less charge, with more of the observer and less of the reactive self. But there is something I want to leave you with. A single principle that contains everything we have explored today. A single recognition that, if you carry it into your life, will change the quality of your observation and therefore the quality of your experience. It is this. You are not here to fix your life. You are here to see it clearly. And what you see clearly transforms. Not as a nice idea, as the fundamental law of a universe that is, at its deepest level, consciousness observing itself. The all looking at itself through your eyes, the quantum field collapsing into specific form in response to the quality of your observation. Reality, not as a fixed structure you navigate, but as a living mirror that reflects, with extraordinary precision, the state of the consciousness that is observing it. You are the observer. You have always been the observer. Every pattern you have been trying to fix, every problem you have been trying to solve, every circumstance you have been trying to change, they have been waiting for you to stop looking at them as problems and start looking at them as information, as a map of the projector, as a precise readout of what has been running in the dark, waiting to be seen. And now you've begun to see, not everything at once, not perfectly, but the direction of your gaze has shifted from the screen to the projector, from the effect to the cause, from the reactive self to the observing awareness. And that shift, that precise, specific, irreversible shift in the direction of your gaze, is the beginning of everything. If you are willing to declare that you have seen something today, not everything, not the final truth, but something that you could not see before you began watching, then I want you to say something in the comments, not to perform it, to anchor it. Because what you declare from the observer position, you make real in the quantum field. Type these words, "I see it now," and it can't unsee itself. Because that is the truth of what has happened here. You have looked at something you have been avoiding. You have brought the observer's gaze to the projector. You have seen, even if only for a moment, what has been running your reality from the dark. And what has been seen cannot return to the dark. It cannot pretend to be invisible again. The seeing is irreversible. What you watch, you change. What you avoid controls you. And what you bring from the unobserved into the observed. What you carry from the dark into the light of your clear, unflinching, compassionate awareness is already transforming. Not because you tried to change it, because you finally looked. The observer is the most powerful position in the universe. Not because it controls, because it sees, and in a mental universe, in a reality that is the all-observing itself through an infinite variety of particular perspectives, clarity is the only force that transforms without resistance. You are that clarity. You have always been that clarity. Underneath everything you have believed yourself to be, underneath every pattern and every wound and every construction, the observer has always been present, always watching, always clear, always the most fundamental thing you are. You were never meant to look away, and today, you chose to look. Go back into your life with the observer's gaze, not fixing, not forcing, watching, seeing clearly, bringing the quality of your attention to everything you have been avoiding and trusting, not as a belief, but as a direct experience of the law, that what you observe, you change. The all is mind, you are the all. And the moment you recognize yourself as the observer rather than the observed, as the projector rather than the screen, as the cause rather than the effect, reality has no choice but to respond. It always has, it always will. Now you see, and what has been seen cannot be unseen. If this transmission has shifted something in you, if you felt the observer position even for a moment, even briefly, even as a recognition rather than an achievement, then share this with someone who is standing at the door of their own room, circling the thing they have not yet been willing to look at directly. Because the greatest gift you can give another person is not advice about what to do. It is the courage to look. And sometimes watching someone else choose to look is the thing that gives us permission to look ourselves. When you share this, you are not just passing along a video. You are creating a field of collective observation, giving someone else permission to turn toward their projector, and that act of witnessing amplifies the clarity for both of you. Stay in the clarity. Stay in the observer position. Come back to it when the rhythm pulls you away, as it will. Return to it without judgment as many times as necessary. Because each return is not a failure. Each return is a practice, and the practice, sustained over time, becomes the most natural thing in the world. Because the observer is what you are, and returning to what you are is not an achievement. It is simply coming home.